at the same time that we were gathering for this prisoner swap, there was a warning of a kinzhal hypersonic missile strike in Ukraine. That's quite a rare thing to happen. So it does send a message that peace is not necessarily being considered. Trump is so reluctant to put any pressure on Putin whatsoever. Why would Putin come to the peace table? Why would he agree to things when he thinks everything is going his way?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're speaking to Maxim Tucker, who is the Times' Ukraine correspondent and joins us now, having just come back from a prisoner exchange near the Belarusian border. Maxim, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
Maxim, you've just returned from one of the largest prisoner exchanges thus far in the war. What can you tell us about what's happened today?
So there's about 270 Ukrainian soldiers who've been returned from captivity, some after 3 years under horrific conditions, including torture. And they've obviously very severely malnourished when they came back. They were emaciated, looking in quite bad shape, but they were nonetheless smiling, very happy to be back. And there were some very joyful moments of spouses reunited with one another, families reunited with one another, which is quite fortunate, really, because this prisoner swap has happened so quickly because of the pressure from the peace talks that the Ukrainian side did not have a chance to notify families. So some families had turned up just hoping to see their loved ones and getting lucky. But of course, many, many other families had turned up and they were looking for relatives, pleading with the soldiers coming off the buses, showing them photos of lost loved ones. And they unfortunately didn't find them. And there was a lot more people who were waiting at the end, hoping for luck tomorrow, hoping that they might see people they'd lost for over the past couple of years. There will be 3 days of exchanges because it's such a big number of prisoners that the logistics are difficult. So I expect that there will be more people waiting tomorrow, hoping to see people return from captivity.
And were you able to speak to any of the prisoners or the people at this exchange?
Yeah, we spoke to 3 prisoners. There was one prisoner who was reunited with his wife, and his wife had told us that she'd come just because she had a dream that she was reunited with him. And on that hunt, she turned up, and it was a lovely, tearful moment they had reuniting. And he was obviously so thrilled to see her. And I think a lot of the soldiers we spoke to were in disbelief that they would come back. Some were obviously still in shock. Some people were not ready to kind of answer questions, but every one of them said that they were thrilled when they came across the border and they realized that they were free again. I mean, obviously these men have endured a tremendous amount, and they will go through rehabilitation now. So all of the interviews are quite short, but you did get a sense of the huge amount of relief that they have. And some of them, they hadn't known anything about the outside world. We spoke to one chap who was from Lysychansk, and he was captured towards the beginning of the war, and he was talking about going home to Lysychansk, and it was impossible to break to him, I think, in that moment, that Lysychansk is now occupied by the Russians.
For many, this will presumably have come as a piece of quite rare good news at the moment, won't it, given the state of things on the world stage?
Absolutely. I mean, the Russians are not making any concessions, any moves towards peace. This is the one thing that they were willing to agree on. It's not really a concession. They obviously get their prisoners back as well. It's something Ukraine has been trying to do throughout the war, is to get prisoners back and offer the Russians their prisoners in exchange. But I think the large number of it will come as a relief to many Ukrainian families and offer hope to others who are still there. And some of the soldiers said to us that there are many, many more prisoners in Russia than the Ukrainians realize. There are so many prisoners of war because a lot of the people who are registered as missing are not registered as Russian captivity. The Russians are not registering prisoners properly. They under-register. And that obviously offers them some leeway if they abuse their prisoners. And unfortunately, many prisoners end up dying in Russian custody. But if they're not registered, then no one will ever know that was the case.
And this exchange follows those talks in Turkey last week. Trump released some sort of post suggesting that he thinks that this could lead to something more. I mean, does this suggest any level of movement in talks, the fact that this was a larger prisoner swap than we've seen before?
I don't think so. The 2 weeks before there was quite a large prisoner swap, about 300. Obviously, not nearly as large as this one. Um, but I think at the same time that we were gathering for this prisoner swap, there was a warning of a kinzhal hypersonic missile strike in Ukraine. That's quite a rare thing to happen. So it does send a message that peace is not necessarily being considered. Trump is so reluctant to put any pressure on Putin whatsoever. Why would Putin come to the peace table? Why would he agree to things when he thinks everything is going his way?
And you've also had an article in the Times this week speaking to the Ukrainian team who signed the US minerals and economic cooperation deal. What have you found out from them?
So it was a really interesting insight into how these negotiations unfolded. I was very curious as to how the deal that was finally signed had dropped so many of the most egregious of Trump's demands, that past military aid would be considered a debt, that US would have access to these minerals in Ukraine and access to the profit and control the profits of them, and we would be able to take the profits from outside Ukraine and Ukraine wouldn't really benefit from them. And they told me that they'd had difficult discussions, that there had been almost kind of mafia-like discussions. They described them as, because for Ukraine this really was a kind of matter of life and death. If they lost US support in that moment, it would have been very, very difficult to continue the war. But they were able to employ a British US law firm, which really helped them. They basically kind of outmaneuvered Trump's political demands by taking a constructive approach and just saying, okay, you want to achieve this, but how do we rationalize this? There is a different set of law that governs intergovernmental relations and different set of law for private contracts. So how can we build this? And in the end, they ended up with an agreement that actually, although it doesn't win the security guarantee that Zelensky wanted, allows for the US to provide Ukraine with weaponry as a contribution, as an investment into this fund, so that any money that the US spends on arming Ukraine can be recovered from future profits in this fund. I mean, obviously, the very important thing about this fund, and that Trump should realize, is that in order for it to be a success, Ukraine needs to survive as a nation. Its infrastructure and its businesses need to be protected. And Ukraine is waiting to see what the kind of next step will be. It also requires a lot of upfront US capital investments in the fund, which Ukraine says it will match, in order to explore some of this mineral wealth and to start getting it out of the ground.
So, has this deal allowed for some more confidence in Kiev about the possibility of ongoing cooperation and support from the Trump regime?
Yeah, I think it has provided some optimism about that. It certainly, they feel that this is a way that the US can provide support without being a cost to the US taxpayer, and that was something Trump was really keen about. It doesn't guarantee that the White House will do that, but it provides a mechanism by which they can. So the next step now is that the fund came into force on Friday. A board needs to be set up, and then investments need to be selected and reviewed. And I think Ukraine is very much willing to see that be as effective as possible. They're really dedicated, committed to it. You could see from the team really anxious to get it going. But they said that it is really important that everyone realizes this will only work if we get these kind of Patriot air defense missiles, which would safeguard Ukrainian facilities. Otherwise, how on earth a company is going to come in and try and extract mineral wealth? We need these things to be protected. The other thing that they said was interesting was that they think that the Trump administration sees this kind of agreement as a model for providing support and to build for model for its alliances in the future. It is no longer obviously going to provide support for free just because it wants to help democracies. So it is going to try and extract a tangible benefit. And this is a kind of groundbreaking, pioneering agreement that would allow that to happen between states. So they think that it's really important for Trump to make this work, and they hope that that will be a basis for future support going forward.
Presumably, then the US's Scott Bessant, who was pretty key to getting this deal done on the US side, is someone that Kiev feels they can really do business with compared to the more erratic Trump and JD Vance.
Right. Well, I think they definitely feel they can do business with Bessant. They appealed to his world. This is why it was structured as an investment fund. This is the kind of background he understands. This is the kind of the things that they were aiming for. The language that he was talking. That's what the reason why they hired U.S. lawyers. Um, so I think that is he is someone they feel they can do business with if as long as they speak his language. And I think they they decided to interpret Trump's controversial demands and his outbursts on Truth Social about this deal as just impatience for getting this deal done. They said they felt a huge amount of pressure to get the deal done in time, and it was astonishing that they managed to do it in 2 months because it's quite a convoluted deal. But I think their point was that if you have these very difficult political demands, that you don't try and fight back on it on a political level with Trump. It doesn't really work. But you focus on the practicalities and actually saying, like, this is what we can do, this is what we want to do. And they hope by showing that they were constructive and engaged and simply asking questions and trying to make these political demands a reality and pointing out when they can't be made a reality, that they will show that their negotiating tactics are very different from the Russians. And that's really what they want to see here, is that they want to show willing and show that the Russians are the problem.
And Maxim, you talked about the almost mafia-like way that some of these negotiations went on. It almost seems like there are two sides to the Trump team when it comes to making these deals. How different was it behind the scenes? And has Kiev really set the precedent here for how you can make these deals on the world stage with Trump?
Right. Well, I think it's clear, and it's been clear for a long time, that Trump doesn't really have an eye for detail. He makes these political demands, and he's talking about a minerals deal, which I think actually everyone who was involved in knew for some time actually that it wasn't really a minerals deal. It was a deal for sharing profits extracted from Ukraine's natural resources, and it would be done in the shape of an investment fund. So a minerals deal is just like the optics of it, but Trump kind of latches onto these things and keeps talking about them. Um, you know what his main what he's mainly keen on was saying that he had sealed a deal with Ukraine, that he would be extracting some kind of tangible benefit from this alliance. And that was what they focused on achieving. And again, yeah, it's about the practicalities, the details. And once you agree to something, then you open up, the detail of it, and then you're negotiating with a set of lawyers actually, and a kind of a team of who have the right kind of mind and the right attention to detail for dealing with these things. And they said that, when we started asking rational questions, we got rational replies. And I think it was helpful to take the sting out of the discussion by doing this at the level of detail that they did within the ministry, rather than having Zelensky having to go back to Trump and try and kind of argue against things that they felt were unfair.
And how much do you think, Maxim, this has marked a shift in the US in their approach to the Ukraine-Russia conflict? If not onto Kiev's side, at least stopping it from making these almost attacks on Zelensky.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how it plays out, because obviously Trump invested a lot in wanting to be able to say that he had this deal, that to proclaim himself as a deal maker and show himself as successful. I think that was the most important thing. The next step, obviously, is to start funding this agreement to make it a reality, not just a kind of optics thing, which he's done to be able to say that he's a deal maker. So the level of investment in this fund up front from the US will, I think, show what its real commitment is to Ukraine. What it will do in terms of military support, if it's writing it off against future profits, then Trump can say it's a good deal for the US. But those are the things that I think will really test whether this is a shift in attitude from the US. The noises that the Trump administration are making now is that this peace deal is too difficult. It's not our war. We're preparing to walk away. We think that Putin is going to win this anyway, and that is not reassuring for the Ukrainians. That's something that they'll be worried about. So focusing on making this work, it seems to be like their priority at the moment.
And what does this say about the general feeling in Ukraine about US support?
Well, I think it says that Ukraine wants to be cautiously optimistic. It's trying very hard not to get thrown when Trump makes these statements on Truth Social. It's trying to interpret um, his political statements in the kindest way possible and trying to understand where the emotion's coming from. They were interpreting this as impatience to get this thing done. Um, but I think it's anyone's guess at the moment. They obviously don't know exactly where they stand with the U.S. administration. They know they need the support of the U.S. They know they need them on side. They also know that there are a lot of people in the U.S. government that are on Ukraine's side, that at lower levels of government that do want to support Ukraine, and they hope if they're constructive and they're not giving Trump any kind of excuses to pull out of supporting Ukraine, that they'll achieve something. But whether that will be a successful strategy remains to be seen.
So there is some more confidence among some in Ukraine about support from outside of the White House in the US. People like Lindsey Graham in the US Congress or Marco Rubio, for example.
Yeah, I think those are people that have spoken in support of Ukraine for a long time. They hope that they still have influence in the Republican Party, that they still have influence over the administration. Um, And if the Ukrainians are doing everything that they're asked to do, which is what they're doing at the moment, what is the reason that Trump can give to say I'm pulling out of this? So I think that's their strategy. So be constructive, approach everything with a positive attitude, give out positive message, and not they're not public. They're being very careful not to publicize any misgivings about what Trump says, and that the earlier challenges, the tactic that Zelensky had was when Trump said something that was misinformation, that clearly challenge it straight away. They have been very, very much more measured recently in doing that. And I think we expect that to continue as long as they believe that there is hope. I think, also the things have changed in that I think Zelensky may have felt that he needed to challenge Trump in order to bolster that European support and to get Europe rallying around him. He has achieved that now. Now he's going to try and consolidate the European support, but also try and win over the US.
And outside of the US, what support now do you think Kiev will want from Europe?
Well, I think it's the same as ever. They want more weapons. They need more weapons. They need funding for humanitarian projects in Ukraine. They need to support for their economy. Um, they need to know that Europe is in this is invested in supporting Ukraine, even if the US withdraws, and they want Europe to be compensating for any shortfall in US aid. So far, it's under the Trump administration, they have only provided 50 million, which is a drop in the ocean, really. The thing that Ukraine is really struggling with at the moment is that nobody else produced Patriots missiles, and Patriot missiles are the only missiles capable of shooting down Russian ballistic missiles, which have been had a huge impact on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and that is one of the reasons why they're so keen to engage the US, because they just really need these Patriot systems.
And we are hearing reports of further fears that Russia is in the early stages of some sort of summer offensive, but there has been very little movement this year inside Ukraine itself by the Russians. Can Russia make any more meaningful gains this year, do you think?
Well, Russia is making creeping advances. They have reached the border of the Dnipropetrovsk region, which is something that Ukraine has been very worried about. It opens up a whole new avenue of advance towards one of Ukraine's largest cities, Dnipro, which is home to 1 million people. Dnipro also very strategically important because it is a military hub that allows Ukraine to deploy forces to the south and the east quite rapidly. So I think Ukraine is going to be worried about that. There's been a lot of talk about an offensive in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, but I think Ukrainian forces are quite well prepared there for that. The Kursk offensive was partly to try and stop that happening, to fight the Russians and kill as many Russian troops and limit their ability to mount offensive options on their own soil. I think that the other thing that people are now worried about is that these kind of war games that are being talked about in Belarus might be a pretext to make another attack on Kiev from Belarus. And that is something I think people are worried about. But Russia's offensive capability at the moment is really very much in question. Any offensive movement on the battlefield now, it obviously necessarily involves exposing yourself, going out of cover, and advancing. And when you have so many drones in the air that you can be so easily spotted, and you can be hunted individually by these FPV drones, that is incredibly costly for anyone to do. And how much more material and manpower is Russia willing to sacrifice? It's a question that we will probably find out this summer.
And that coincides with a lot of the messaging from the Kremlin, though, doesn't it, about there not really being any sort of ceasefire or peace deal around the corner. I mean, we had a message from Lavrov today, the Russian foreign minister, turning down Trump's idea that there could be more talks hosted in the Vatican. There is no feeling in Ukraine, is there, that some sort of ceasefire breakthrough is just around the corner?
No, I don't think Ukrainians are expecting a ceasefire breakthrough. They are expecting to have these peace talks in order to demonstrate to the Americans that they are not an obstacle to peace, that the only obstacle to peace is the Russians. Unfortunately, Trump doesn't seem to care that much about that. He thinks that Putin is going to win the war anyway and is looking for ways to get out of it. And I think that is going to make it very difficult for Ukraine in the coming months unless Europe rapidly ramps up its support.
Well, Maxim Tucker, Ukraine correspondent for the Times, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can sign up for membership at the link below or subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.